apologize for the bit of a bumpy start. Technology is not always our best friend for accessibility, but we are trying. If you look into the chat right now and you have access issues, our wonderful technology assistant, Billy Stapleton, is putting instructions into the chat, and hopefully that will help you. And this is a really good, I think, example as we start to talk today about disability justice. This is the second of our Common Awards Disability and Theology webinars, and I'm so happy to be joined today by two absolutely fantastic people and speakers. So joining us today is Reverend Dr. Hannah Lewis, who is a deaf priest, bilingual in BSL and English, working in the Oxford Diocese. She's also a freelance researcher, writer, and presenter. Her PhD thesis was published as Deaf Liberation Theology, and she has published a number of journal articles and book chapters since then, most recently in the book Challenging Contextuality, Bibles and Biblical Scholarship in Context. Our other speaker, is Naomi Lawson Jacobs, who uses the pronouns they, them, who is disabled and neurodivergent and is the co-author of At the Gates, Disability, Justice and the Churches. This book was based on participatory research with disabled Christians. Naomi is a research associate at Manchester Metropolitan University. They are currently editing a volume of disability theology written by disabled people, as well as co-editing a special issue of a disability studies journal. Naomi is a trustee for Disability Rights UK and sits on the Church of England's Neurodiversity Working Group. So welcome, Hannah, welcome, Naomi, and also welcome and thank you to Jill and Rachel, who are our BSL interpreters for today. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Anupama Ranawana, and I am a postdoc with the Common Awards team. So I'm going to start us off by asking Hannah and Naomi some questions, and then we'll try to have a breakout group if the technology works. We'll try to bring in a comfort break, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of discussion together. If you have any questions or any concerns, please put it into the chat, the general chat, or feel free to message me directly as well. And please, I thank you for your graciousness as we organize and navigate our way through the technology as well. So Hannah and Naomi, welcome, thank you. I'm going to start with this question. You have both stressed the importance of disability justice. And you say it's not just inclusion and representation in theological education. Can you tell us how you understand or frame disability justice?
Okay, so we've agreed I'm going to start on this one. And just want to clarify, for the purpose of this webinar, the word disability includes deaf, neurodivergent, hidden disability, chronic illness, the whole range of what people might identify as disability, because the concept, for me, the concept of disability justice actually encompasses everyone. It's taking a wider overview rather than focusing in on individual perspectives. And for me, disability justice is how we view the whole issue around disability, because there is a tendency in society to frame disability as a category all off by itself, all off to one side. Now, we'll talk about racial justice, we talk about gender justice, we talk about LGBTQIA plus injustice and all these things, and we don't necessarily see disability as part of that wider framework, even though it is we're all in the Equalities Act together now. We no longer have our own separate one. And if you dig into this assumption that disability is somehow different to all the other protected characteristics, is that they tend to frame our understanding of disability. We're talking about care, we're talking about access, we're talking about inclusion, because I think disability is somehow different because it's something wrong with us. what we would call the medical model or the deficit model of how we frame disability, and focused on individuals, focusing on where we are different in relation, what we can't do. And there are a lot of alternative ways of understanding disability that have been created by disabled people themselves to challenge the deficit model, because the deficit model simply doesn't match how we experience ourselves. You know, I don't experience myself as lacking hearing. I experience myself as a deaf person. It is two different things. And so, for example, alternative models that you may be familiar with, the concept of something called the social model, which some disabled people use to frame the fact that, you know, the problem isn't disability, the problem is society is not set up. You know, the society is set up for some kind of able-bodied norm. There are, so for example, if ramps and level access and automatic doors were normal, you know, anybody using a wheelchair would have considerably fewer barriers to negotiate. For deaf people, we have something called the cultural linguistic model. So deaf British Sign Language users are a linguistic and cultural minority in this country. There is a growing concept of neurodivergency that understands autism, ADHD and a whole load of other related things as differently wired brains, for example. And there are other models too, and you cannot simplify and say this model all disabled people subscribe to, because it's never that simple. But they all reject, I would say, the deficit model. They all reject the idea that you can purely and simply understand us by saying there's something wrong with us. And they all identify barriers to full participation, disabled people's full participation in society, as being partly caused by social and external factors and not intrinsic to being disabled. And therefore, once we're talking about social barriers that can be fixed by social action, we are definitely talking in the realms of justice and equality. We are talking about the same sort of legislative changes or other changes that serve the interest, racial justice, gender justice, so on and so forth. And another concept I will do to link to justice is liberation. Liberation for disabled people isn't about fixing us so that we can take part in normal society. Liberation is liberation that the whole community take responsibility for making sure that everybody is part of it, whatever that looks like. There are always going to be different levels of participation, different levels of what we want, regardless of who we are. But it's a whole community responsibility in a just and liberated society. And for me, that's where it gets theological. Each one of us is created in the image of God. Each one of us is a child of God. God promises abundant life for all of creation. So, if some people are being blocked from abundant life by barriers, removing them isn't just about human justice, it's also about divine justice. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Naomi for now.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, completely agree. I wanted to acknowledge where the term disability justice comes from, as we talk about that much more now when we used to talk more about disability rights. And rights are still part of the conversation, but there's been this really powerful move to talking about justice, and as Hannah said, to seeing justice as interconnected and intersectional. And there's a movement that started in the United States that is led by disabled people of colour and trans and queer people, who talk about disability justice needing to be led by the most marginalised disabled people, and needing to be an intersectional movement because of the ways that white supremacy is linked to ableism and gender injustice is linked to ableism. All these things came from the same roots. And Leah Lakshmi Samara Sinha, who wrote a book called Care Work about disability justice, says, disability justice means we are not left behind. We are beloved, kindred, needed. And what I love about that book is that it's not theological, but it reads to me as theological. They talk about, not about deficit, but about who we value and who can flourish in society as a result of reorganizing society so that we care for each other and we understand that we all need to care for each other. And there aren't some people who are more in need and who can be left on the scrap heap when we don't have the resources to meet those needs. So that's a wonderful book that I recommend. And because of that movement, this term ableism has become more well known. Disability scholars were talking about ableism before, but they've really brought ableism into the conversation in a very powerful way. And talking about reshaping society and institutions that are based on ableist values, which to me, with my theological hat on, are the values that don't look like the kingdom of God and don't honor, as Hannah said, bodies that are valued by God, but not by society and body minds. And so this shift from rights to liberation has been really important, as Hannah says. But rights remain part of the justice conversation. And in this society, disabled people are really lacking in rights and living in a very precarious, unjust situation. So just a few examples of that are the very high levels of poverty that disabled people live in, including food poverty. A majority of people who use food banks have disabled members, for example. It costs about £1,000 extra per month on average just to be disabled. And you can start to see how disabled people fall into poverty. The benefits and care systems that we live under are inadequate and have been implicated in disabled people's deaths. So nearly half of the deaths of people with learning disabilities, the government acknowledges, are preventable deaths, but we are not preventing them. And the benefit system is currently leading to deaths and suicide and deaths from awful things like starvation in a country that is one of the richest countries in the world. And this is how our citizens who are disabled are being left on the scrap heap. And the UN in 2017 said the government had perpetrated grave and systematic violations of human rights, leading to a human catastrophe for disabled people. And they emphasized that again when they came back to review the situation recently. So we have rights granted by the state, but the problem is they can be taken away at any time, and the state decides what rights it's going to give us and what injustices it's willing to address and which ones it's not. So the question of disability rights versus disability justice is really important. And rights for disabled people can fall really short of what I think is God's vision of justice, certainly a biblical vision of justice. So we have in this country the Equality Act that, as Hannah says, is really important because it's a tool for our equality sometimes when we don't have any other tools. But it also is based on concepts like reasonable adjustments, which say that it must be reasonable what we're asking for in terms of access, and who decides what is reasonable it's often strongly influenced by the institutions that are denying us rights. So there is a lot of injustice that rights are not necessarily helping us with, although I think we still need to fight for more rights because we live in a civil society based on the idea of civil rights. So thinking about justice then has been something that the disability justice movement and critical disability studies has been useful for me, but theology has also been really useful here. My book At the Gates frames a vision of justice that's based on liberation theologies of disability. I'm strongly influenced by Hannah's work, by John Hull, by Nancy Easland in the States, and other interpretations of the Bible that understand God's justice as being centered around the poorest and most marginalized people in society. And when you start to look at where disabled people are in society, it can be very easy to think, well, I work with a disabled person and they're doing fine and they have rights. But we're often missing the voices of the most marginalized and poorest people. And our visions of justice too will also always be partial because we have different interpretations of the Bible and different understandings of the story of God's people there. But I think we need a broad picture of justice where a lot of different people with different experiences are in conversation with each other about these theological visions of justice, and where we're asking, who does our vision of justice center, and does it reflect Jesus's mission to the margins and their mission to him? and that kind of interactional justice that we see in the Gospels. And at the same time, I think we need to be in conversation with these secular ideas that Hannah mentioned. So cultural models of disability, models like the neurodiversity paradigm, that to me echo theological concepts and talk about God's diversity of creation. And so for me, these secular stories are an echo of the kingdom too. And if we're in conversation with all the domains that disabled people move in, our Christian lives, our church lives, our secular lives, our work lives, our leisure lives, we'll start to see that disabled people's wisdom might be popping up in places that are not necessarily books about theology, but are wisdom from the margins. And yeah, when people from the margins are listened to, quite exciting things happen in churches.
Thank you so much, both of you, for these incredibly strong opening thoughts, which I'm sure that we'll start to probe more as we go through the webinar. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on a little bit more to unpack this. And you've both talked about how there's so many models and concepts that have a sort of a theological nuance or a theological understanding, and you've also both alluded as to why inclusion and representation are not enough. So if we move on from that, what would you say to the question of what can theological institutions do to move towards that disability justice?
Yeah, so I was going to tackle this first, I think. I've been really inspired here by theologian Erin Rafferty, who talks about the way that churches can move from inclusion to justice. And she talks about inclusion being a way that we draw people from the edge into our spaces that have been designed for the people who tend to run churches, which is often white-centric churches, male-centric churches, non-disabled-centric churches. And we think we need to draw some needy people in trouble into those spaces and everything will be all right. But the trouble is that those spaces are often not our home and they're not our spaces. So a lot of people I spoke to for At the Gates talked about physical, cultural and theological barriers that got in the way of their full participation and flourishing in churches. They wanted to be a full part of their communities, but these communities weren't designed to be places for them. And so that led to barriers. And the alternative is to think about transforming churches, starting with the people on the edge who have prophetic wisdom to bring, to talk about how churches need to change so that all can hear the gospel and so that the Spirit can be poured out on all flesh. And so these are places where disabled people and other marginalised groups are needed, participate and lead. And not for its own sake, not just so that we have a diverse church and we can pat ourselves on the head, but in a vision of a diverse kingdom where we all flourish because all our values are turned upside down by people who have experienced these injustices and know what's wrong with the world and call churches to do something about that. And it's really exciting when that happens. John Hull, who I mentioned before, blind theologian, said that disabled people are not pastoral problems, we are prophetic potential for the church. And it's a wonderful way of saying that our stories will change things, and that kind of disruption is really needed. But in my research, I found, certainly with the people I talked to, that a lot of perspectives in theology and churches about disabled people are non-disabled people's perspectives. And those are important because disability affects whole communities and we need to hear from carers and we need to hear from professionals. But there weren't a lot of perspectives that people were hearing from people like them. And I talked about pastoral power in At the Gates, which is power that really believes it has the best interests of people at heart and wants to look after needy people, but doesn't then give them agency to help transform the institutions that we're all in together. And in secular disability studies, we call this benevolent ableism. So I spoke to someone called Isabel, who talked about how if she wanted to use an accessible toilet at her church, she had to ask somebody to come and unlock the door with her. And first of all, she said, well, it's fine. I don't mind having to ask. And then later in the interview, she said, well, I'm the only person who has to ask for the door to my toilet to be unlocked. And that was affecting her flourishing in this community, that she was reliant on other people, and there was no understanding that her access was part of a theological vision of justice, even just to toilets. All these facilities are how we live out the values of the kingdom of God. And someone who is always asking for the key in their workplace might want to come to church on Sunday and be able to participate in a much more meaningful way. Someone in the chat asked me what kind of power, pastoral power. It's an idea from Michel Foucault, who was not talking about churches, but it's very interesting when you look at churches in that light. And Miranda Fricker is a philosopher and theologian who talks about epistemic injustice, which is injustice where we don't hear people's stories and people's voices. And that was what a lot of the people I spoke to were facing. Churches who were very interested in outreach to them, and that is a good thing, but weren't then interested in what happens next and how we can empower each other. And we're often thinking of disabled people as moral lessons for the church, how we can do well by serving disabled people and we can be better Christians, but not how disabled people can serve us. And there has been a lot of discussion about this recently, a growing stream of discussion, which is really exciting to see. And I've called it critical disability theology. And starting with Nancy Iceland and work like Hannah's, we've started talking about, in conversation with critical disability studies, about the ways that disability theology and disabled people's perspectives can transform churches. And don't have to be something on the margins of theology, but can be at the centre. And when Hannah said that disability theology is about the whole church, I think that's really exciting because it is bringing in insights about listening to the voices of people in marginalised groups that are really powerful for the whole church and are really powerful for people who may not consider themselves disabled, but whose bodies are on this whole human spectrum and whose minds are on this whole human spectrum of diversity, which could mean many different things for their experiences. So yeah, that's why I think inclusion is not enough, and justice is about hearing those voices. Hannah, what were your thoughts?
Okay, so similar to what you said, the access and inclusion are concepts that are very much about bringing people into what's perceived to be the norm. And I've got a couple of specific examples from deaf community experience to discuss, because obviously that's what I'm most familiar with. And one of them is the idea that to make the church accessible for deaf people, all you need to do is provide a BSL interpreter for your services. Well, there are lots of issues with that, but what I'm going to go to, working on the idea of justice, is you can have an interpreter for the service, but then what happens at coffee time? If nobody else in the church can use sign language, what happens if the deaf person has a call to ministry? You know, they stand up and sign the Bible reading and the interpreter voices over, and then everybody shuts their eyes. And so as far as they're concerned, it's the interpreter doing the Bible reading. You know, that's just a couple of brief examples of why inclusion is not enough. You need, you know, justice. It's a different concept. It requires everybody to change, everybody to do something differently. So that's just an example from in church. Theology. Has it ever occurred to you that the whole subject of theology is one of the institutions that we need to change? That you can talk about access to theology, and again, all you're talking about is providing a BSL interpreter, a BSL for the lecture. You are not talking about discussing the questions that deaf people are bringing to the whole theological discussion. I mean, one of the chapters in my book is, can Jesus sign? Has it ever occurred to you to ask that question? How does Jesus communicate with deaf people? Because he is always represented as speaking, and that's a huge strand in the Bible. God speaks and people listen. So that's just one. You know, there's no simple answer. It doesn't have to be a simple answer, but just that having that discussion is a sign of justice and theology. It's taking our questions seriously, because I think a lot of deaf and disabled people have brought questions to the table only to have them dismissed, marginalised. Oh, that's not interesting, that's not relevant. And so we're now beginning to talk about the questions we ask in theology, the things we discuss, and also big words like ontology, how we know what we know, and epistemology, about we knowing, how we're framing our knowledge, and how we're presenting it. Because I'm just going to come back in a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about that more in the next section, but continuing the whole using example of deaf people and how our institutions can be more justice, more about disability justice. There's also the different contexts. There tends to be an assumption that there is one church. And obviously, when you're talking about all the different denominations we have and all the disagreements within denominations, that's an interesting. But despite this diversity, there is still an assumption that the sign language using congregations are not properly part of the church. And so we go ahead and cut all the ministers. We stop paying people who know sign language, clergy who know sign language. And that results, the framing of ministry with deaf people is framed as a specialist ministry. The whole topic of disability theology is framed as a minority topic. You know, the whole, it's not interesting. It's not part of what we talk about in our mainstream theology sessions. And, you know, as Naomi said, it's pastoral. You know, you only talk about disabled people when we're talking about pastoral issues, how we look after them. Or maybe in liturgy, we might have a session on how we make worship accessible. But again, how are we talking about theology as a whole, about the church as a whole, when disabled people's questions are as much part of it as anybody else's? And I'm just going to finish my bit on this section with one example. And this is actually a good example of how we can use disability theology. Potential is that I was recently at Holy Cross College in Boston, in America, for a conference. And as I happened to be there anyway, I was asked if I would visit the liberation theology class for a question and answer session, because apparently my book is one of the set texts. Now, there were no deaf students in this class. I mean, I have deaf students in the college and sometimes they go to class, but there were no deaf students in the class. And so when we were presenting, and I mean, it was an interesting session, but when we were presenting on panel, I happened to be presenting with the person who was running this class. And so I asked him in our panel discussion, why do you include deaf liberation theology in this class on liberation theology? And he says, well, I'm trying to show a different, the diversity, how the variety, the spectrum of liberation theology. And deaf and disabled liberation theology is just part of that spectrum. You know, it's relevant to the class. And I just thought that was a good example. It wasn't being presented as a special topic, a one-off topic, something only for people who were interested. All students were getting presented with it on an equal level with, you know, the Latin American, the classic liberation theologies, feminist theologies, black theologies, a whole range. I mean, it's the much wider range than what I've mentioned of what liberation theology is. And I just thought that was a good example. You know, you're not marginalising theology, deaf and disabled theology. It's just there on the table along with the rest.
Thank you both so much. I just, before I move us into sort of the next question, you've both talked so much about power and power formations. And I wonder if I can ask you to reflect a little bit more about that. And are you sort of looking at this and saying that perhaps how we frame power pastorally and how we frame power theologically is different, and that's a crucial issue, perhaps? Is that something that you're both sort of thinking, or not? Thank you.
I often say the best model for theology is the Magnificat. And it's something that we miss. I love the fact that we sing it every single evening in the Church of England, evening prayer, and everybody completely ignores that they're singing a revolutionary hymn. For me, Jesus was all about challenging the power structures of society, however it was framed. And that's what I think theology should be doing, and that's what I think the church should be doing. We should be questioning, everything. What's the power? I mean, just to take an example from today, when this webinar was first proposed, we all assumed it would be on Zoom. And then Anu found out from the university that it had to be on Teams. We all registered a strong protest because it does make access harder, particularly if it's the first time you've used it. The university ignored us. They're the ones that holded the power in this situation. And their power certainly wasn't going to have any exceptions for the sake of access. Whereas in a truly just university, they would have listened and they would be putting access up there along with other needs. So power is about, as Naomi was saying, starting with the most marginalised in the room and looking into what their needs are, and that is our starting point.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you, Naomi, yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to add that I was thinking about Erin Rafferty again, because in her book she tells the story of Bartimaeus, the way that she heard it from a disabled person. And she tells the story of Jesus passing Bartimaeus on the road, and Bartimaeus calling out to him, and Jesus not hearing him or not responding to him. Maybe because the crowd was in the way, or maybe because he couldn't hear over so many voices. And Bartimaeus calls him again, and he calls him the Son of David, a title that is generally given to God by the most marginalized, calling for justice. And you see a moment in which Jesus enters into a blind man's world. He stops and he listens, and he tunes out the crowd, and he goes to the sense that Bartimaeus is using, and he goes to find Bartimaeus, and he goes to the edge. And then the crowd say, come and see Jesus. The crowd, who have been very negative when Bartimaeus starts calling at the beginning, are transformed by that. And we always talk about the transformation of the crowds, but we don't always talk about the transformation of Jesus, and how Jesus, through that relational conversation with the blind man, maybe is being called back to his mission to the margins. And maybe we all need to be called back to a mission to the margins all the time, even the Son of God, who was being distracted by a crowd. And that kind of rereading is what happens when more marginalized voices than others are given the chance to tell stories about theology. So theology comes through our power, the way that we preach, who gets to interpret these stories, and who leads in churches and who gets to lead in churches. And I think we're going to go into that in a minute, but yeah, this access to all structures in churches includes access for the most marginalized to help us change the stories, and to call us back to the way that God understands power, the way that the kingdom of God turns our social understanding power upside down.
Thank you so much, both of you. And I think, what you say about the constant and ongoing mission at the margins, but it's also kind of turning the idea of mission on its head is also what you're talking about there, as well. I'll move us into our next question, and this is going to be hopefully very, very practical kind of exploration. I can see that we have a lot of TEI staff and registrars on the call, so I know this will be very helpful for you. What kinds of teaching and research practices do we need that would be grounded in disability justice as you see it?
So I was thinking here about three things that are coming out of TEIs and relate to common awards. I think it's about the curriculum, it's about pedagogy, and it's about how we do research. So in terms of the curricula that we teach and create, I'm really influenced in my thinking by a philosopher called Sara Ahmed, who talks about access to institutional knowledge and access to universities and the knowledge that comes out of them. And she talks about citational politics, the politics of who we cite and who we reference. And she says we play games to show that we're part of power structures. And as a new early career researcher, I know this experience. I come into a room and if I'm asked to speak, I start by citing all the people that the audience will have heard of to show that I'm on the same level as them, especially as a visibly disabled person. I would try to establish that I'm one of the elite, and it's a terrible game to play. And we cite those in power, and we don't cite the people on the edge doing really interesting theology. So one example is that I try to quote Fiona Macmillan regularly, who leads a conference community, which is a venue in the Church of England led by disabled people, where disabled people for over a decade have come together to frame our own theologies. It's such an exciting space. And the idea is that we resource each other and then reach out to our churches. In this turning upside down of mission that you talked about, Annie, we have a mission back to our churches once we have had space to develop our own ideas without being spoken over. But I never see voices from this conference like Fiona's being referenced in disability theology. The same names come up over and over again. And in the past, those were particularly non-disabled names. I think it's becoming more diverse, but they are still the people in institutions who have the PhDs. I say as one of them. So it's really important to me that when we look at our curricula, we ask which voices have never been heard and what could those add to the conversation. You might have to go well beyond books to find those voices, like to conferences like Fiona's. I will put a link to that community and conference in a minute in the chat. But yeah, it's that from that comes my question of sort of how are TIs engaging with the kind of theology that's happening on the edge and in the margins, and that where people want to come in mission to the church and say, here are our resources, here are our ways of theologically thinking about things like disability, where we are the experts in the end. So how are TIs challenging their own citational politics when they write curricula? Who's on the reading list, which might need to include some big names, but who else is there? And then the pedagogical approaches and philosophies, TIs are in a really powerful position to enable disabled people's leadership in churches. They're involved in the formation stage. Disabled people's leadership has not always been welcomed in churches, as a lot of my storytellers in At the Gates talked about. And just one example was a storyteller with mobility impairments, a priest who talked about having to lead church in a non-disabled way. So being constantly encouraged to stand to give communion and to preach from a raised pulpit, and constantly having to disrupt that and say, well, no, I'm going to sit down because that's the way that I flourish as a priest, and that's the way I serve my congregation best as a preach. And these very simple kind of ways that churches and theological institutions can be landscapes of power, where we don't challenge the ways that we are teaching. And so Miriam Spies is an American who writes about her experience as a disabled person in a seminary in the US, and she talks about I'll put her title in the chat as well, but she talks about her vocation to disrupt the ableist norms in institutions, and how she wanted to work with her seminary, and sometimes did really well at this. Sometimes they listened and worked with her when she was saying, I can't do that, I'm going to do it this way, and we're going to put up with that, but also maybe that's the way we should have done it all along. That disruptive prophetic potential and prophetic ministry. So I would ask our TIs, going beyond those legal frameworks of reasonable adjustments, are they having very anxious conversations about how far they can include, or are they excited to enable disabled people and to model leadership that makes space for disabled people's voices? And on a practical level, there's lots of advice out there on how to make things more accessible on a basic level to blind people and to deaf people and to neurodivergent people. But a more interesting story is somebody at the Gates called Gemma, who is blind and wanted to take part in a theology course, but all of the texts that were being taught were not available on audiobook. And at a simple level of reasonable adjustments, you can put accessible PDFs of chapters online that screen readers can read, but that's a reasonable adjustment. It's not changing the system. There could be a ministry for TEIs to talk to the big Christian publishers in this country and say, why is so little disability theology available in these accessible formats? And audiobooks will only be one of those accessible formats. So it's working with the disabled people in your institutions to model leadership, to enable leadership, and to encourage that prophetic ministry. And then finally, in terms of research, I know there's a lot of research around disability and neurodiversity coming out of TAs at the moment, which is so exciting to see. And my question would be sort of how are you researching with disabled people? And are you using methods that have been pioneered in disability studies to make sure that disabled people are empowered by research and that it's not extractive of disabled people's knowledge without giving back to the disabled people who take part? Is this research to empower, or is it research that reinscribes injustices? And that's a bigger question that we could have another time. I don't know the answers to these questions, but from my experience of some guest lecturing with TAs and theological seminaries, I've been really encouraged to see some of this. So I recently guest lectured at a seminary in the US for a first-year student seminar, and their knowledge of disability justice and disability theology was astounding. And I had read no disability theology when I was in the first year of my degree. It was absolutely wonderful to see what range of text was on their curriculum and how they were engaging with those and engaging with other voices beyond those texts. So I think there are exciting changes that this is beginning to happen internationally in theological institutions.
I just want to pick up a bit on what Naomi said about the citational politics, because that was always one of the big things for me. I said when I was doing my PhD, and I mean, I have to say, I started my PhD 30 years ago, and things were different then. I'm not entirely sure I would have got it today if I'd been doing it today because of some of the changes that have happened. But I said in my PhD, and it's in my book, I'm not interested in what hearing people have to say about deaf people. Tends to upset some people tend to get very upset at that line, but so that meant that when I'm working, I'm trying to find sources that are by deaf people themselves. They're not usually written, or if they are written, they've been published in deaf people's own magazines, you know, at a very basic level of English. None of them are conventional texts. And I constantly have to justify what texts I use. And that takes, and when I'm trying to write a journal article, that's taking huge amount of words, because I'm constantly having to redefine, reframe the ontology and epistemology that I'm using. And I think that while obviously TEIs, you're following the framework of theology in general, I sometimes wonder if that's something we can't start by challenging, use our role to challenge theology. Challenge a norm, you know. It's got to be more than one or two people doing this for this to work. So look at broadening the scope of what's an acceptable reference, what's an acceptable citation, what's an acceptable source. You know, teaching people to use video, to use blogs, to use vlogs, to use you know, conversations as sources. Instead of people having to make up their own methods and then justify them, start creating a shorthand, you know, of use of sources that you can refer to. And that also links to the contextual thing. If you are a student in a TEI who comes from a non-parish context, for example, the deaf church, but there are other non-parish contexts. Again, you have to use huge amounts of words in your essay to describe the context before you can even start writing the essay. So why can't TEIs teach about a wide range of context as normative, instead of constantly making the student do all this extra work just to get to the base level of everybody else? And you can also, so okay, that's probably enough about sources because I'm aware of time. And we've already talked about the questions of deaf, disabled and neurodivergent people as often being dismissed. And in biblical studies, Warren Carter points out that gospel commentaries often screen out disabled bodies when they discuss the healing miracles. They render the healing miracles as being primarily symbolic, or they spiritualise it in some way. Whereas if you are disabled or neurodivergent, the hero miracles, they're definitely not. There are issues of power there. There are issues of past. You have to have a critical approach, which disability theology takes, and a very creative approach sometimes. I mean, Naomi has already discussed the Bartimaeus, the interpretation of Bartimaeus' healing. Deaf people have a reading of the healing of the deaf man, well known in the deaf world, and I think almost unknown anywhere else. It says the deaf man wasn't made to hear, he learned sign language and how to access the deaf community, and that was his healing and that was his liberation. So you've got all this fascinating stuff out there that's just being ignored. So deaf and disabled people aren't just talking about deaf and disabled theology, we are talking about theology. Everything is theological. Everybody's theology is contextual. It's just the context of certain people has been taken to be normative. The questions of certain people has been taken to be normative. So we need to start to question, well, what is normal in theology, and challenging that. All theology is about the relationship between God and humanity. And humanity is far more diverse than your average theologian, published theologian. And we had a question that was raised in the run-up to this webinar from someone called Connor. I don't know if he's here today, about the fact that he's tried to ask questions in previous seminars about spirituality and prayer and neurodivergency, and found that those questions, people just want to talk about access and inclusion. And that is a perfect example of why disability justice goes places that access and inclusion don't. So I don't know if Naomi is going to address this question or what we want to do at this point.
Yeah, if we had time, Anu, I had a thought on Connor's question as well, because I think it got both me and Hannah thinking in interesting ways. I was thinking, so as a secular scholar, my At the Gates is a book of social sciences in conversation with theology, co-written by a theologian, but I'm not one. Although it's funny how you become one. But yeah, that's not my main work. But so I was thinking, sort of, what's my responsibility as a disability scholar who isn't myself a theologian, but my participants and my storytellers in At the Gates are very much theologians. And I think that my answer from me, which won't be every theologian's answer, is back to this idea of amplifying the voices of people who are already creating their own resources around prayer and spirituality, and how they live as Christians, which is so exciting to see happening sort of in the 15 years since I started my research on this. I've seen a growing disabled Christian movement, with where we're getting together and we're talking about which disability theology texts have been useful for our spirituality and resourcing each other, and talking about how we pray, and how we access the Bible. And a really interesting example of this is that some early theology of autism saw us autistic people through a very medicalized lens and said that maybe we weren't really capable of prayer, which is really worrying, because we're very, very capable of prayer, and I think every human being is, but we might pray differently, and research is beginning to show that, research led by autistic people quite often, and then it becomes a conversation about what can we as autistic people teach the church about prayer that the church always needed to know, and these perspectives on prayer and spirituality that have been shut out, where do they need to be brought back into the conversation?
Thank you, Naomi. I wonder, Hannah, if you wanted to provide any thoughts on interiority in prayer, because I have to tell you, everyone, I was in the pre-conversation and I know it's really interesting.
I can't remember what I said in the pre-conversation about this, but it's been a lot happening since then. But another interesting thing about interiority in prayer is, do deaf people pray in sign language? what was happening in our interiors. And I have to say, has been very little research done about this so far. So everything I know has been through my own personal experience and anecdotally. And the answer is a mixture, I think. But in my research, I found a concept in some of the Victorian deaf people's writing I was reading in this wonderful collection of old church magazines from 1900, 1901. It was wonderful. And they're all talking about perfect communication in prayer. That's how they envisaged it. They didn't specify how it was happening, whether they were signing or thinking or things, but that all the deaf people writing had this idea of this perfect communication. And I actually think that this is sometimes when I talk about Jesus, the Logos. Logos is usually translated as word, but basically it is about how God is communicating with us. And if Jesus is Logos, God, perfect communication, and God created each one of us with all our different communication methods, then yeah, it's a non-question. I mean, I'm not saying it's a non-question to dismiss it. I'm saying that there are all these huge numbers of different ways of going on, and you could have a really fascinating research project talking to all these different people about how they pray and how they communicate with God. And things like that. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area because prayer is a mystery anyway.
Thank you both so much. I think that question on prayer in interiority might be an ongoing exploration for TEIs perhaps, and some may already be doing that work already. So in the interest of time and also technology, I'm going to make the executive decision not to break us into the breakout groups. And perhaps now we can take a short comfort break. I know that people have asked some questions in the chat, so we'll turn our attention to those questions when we come back from our comfort break. So could I ask everyone to come back by 15 minutes past 3, so 3:15. Would that be all right and enough for a comfort break? Thank you. And yes, we will be making the recording, transcript, and audio available if you need to leave now. So please do take your comfort break, and we'll come back, and then Hannah and Naomi will answer any questions that you have, if you've put it into the chat, or if you have some to reflect on when you come back. So I'll see you all in 15 minutes. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So hopefully we're all back. We are 15 minutes past the hour, and so we should have, I think, some good time for discussion. So thank you to people who have put any messages in the chat. I've already taken note of them. If you have any more questions, you can put them in the chat. I think I've also managed to enable people's mics. So if you do have a question and you want to speak it out loud, you can raise your hand. And hopefully I'll be able to you'll be able to come on mic and speak and ask the question. Just to underline that both Naomi and Hannah is communicating between 2 languages, BSL and spoken English, and Naomi is neurodivergent, so they might need a couple of minutes to process and answer your question. And if your question isn't answered, we can always continue the conversation via other means. So I'm going to turn us to the first question that came through from Helen Reynolds, who says we're talking about going to the missions of the margins, and yet theology is in a position of academic privilege. How do you challenge the academy when the academy is power? Hannah, Naomi, whenever you are ready to respond.
Might come in first because I work in the academy, at least for the moment. The jobs are interesting at the moment in academia, but yeah, I have an interesting role. It's It's so funny, isn't it? Because there are a lot of us talking about reaching out to the margins, but it's a massive, massive task to enable, to turn mission upside down in that way we've been talking about, and enable to centre disabled people's voices. And that does mean more disabled theologians. It means more disabled priests and church leaders, and that means challenging institutions where those people are trained. And there is some great practice out there, but it is a huge issue of justice. As someone who works in a team where I know that everybody is really committed to good research with disabled people and research that leads to justice, I also work in an institution where I can't really work in the office because the lighting is incredibly painful for me and makes me very, very ill. And I've been to many, many religious studies conferences where I couldn't even get in the door in my wheelchair. And I remember having coffee outside one international conference because the coffee room wasn't accessible, and standing in the rain and thinking, okay, this is how welcome disabled people are in theology and religious studies. So it's a massive ongoing problem. I think it's a problem in lots of disciplines in academia, but theology is a big one, because theology's come from church institutions and from institutions where there was a lot of hierarchical power. Even though that doesn't look like the kingdom of God, it continues. And we have, especially in the Church of England, which I'm a member of, we have huge structures, and fighting those and transforming those is like turning a very large tanker. So in terms of how you do this, there is some great wisdom, again, from disabled people. There is a lot of work on research with disabled people that has really inspired my work, on how research needs to be about us as researchers putting our skills in the hands of disabled people. And I would say the same thing for teachers and TEIs, putting your skills as teachers in the hands of those who have the experience and the resources. But there are going to be huge challenges along the way. And there are a lot of us in this very liminal space as disabled academics who can't always get through the door, who can't always work in the offices, and who can't always take part in the conversation. And it's just a really slow movement towards progress, I think, of talking about it more, of people were talking in the chat about working together as TEIs and pooling resources, and finding out what other people are doing to enable access and change the conversation. But it is really difficult, yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I think we should scrap the academy and start again. Anu and I communicate various different ways, and we've been talking about setting up dreaming of a free university. But now I think one of the biggest challenges is in the funding of research. Because a lot of the time you have questions in this area, you can't even get funding, especially in theology. I mean, Naomi works social sciences because that's where the funding is. I know somebody who is actually currently trying to find a research role in doing some deaf theology, and she's almost certainly not going to be able to. For there are just so many barriers in the way. So what she's doing, I mean, she's going ahead and doing the research anyway, and as a completely independent, it's unlikely to be ever accredited by university, it's unlikely to be published. But what we're looking to doing is getting it up on a website and then promoting the hell out of it on social media, so that it then becomes a thing. And I think one of the big differences now, because of the internet, there are so many more outlets for theology. There are so many more opportunities for people who are on the margins, assuming they can access the internet, which is a whole other question, to share theology. I mean, the Deaf Church on Facebook, where it's so easy to share things through sign language and videos. So there's some fascinating, we have this older deaf elders from Ireland regularly posting little videos of little songs they've created. I mean, I haven't had time to sit down and think about what to do with them, but it's beginning to be out there, but it's unconventional, it's different places, it's different platforms. And I think what we can do for those of us who work with the academy is bring those into our work so that the knowledge of it becomes more widely known. So there is research practices, there's interviews and consultations and things, but there's also treating those as sources, treating what other people have created as sources, discussing them seriously, and making them more widely known in that way. So I think that's one of the things we can do. And about funding, I mean, I'm not in the academy. I have, apart from briefly when I started doing my research, I have never been funded by anybody. I make about £100 a year if I'm lucky from what I have published so far. So I've had to find different ways to it, and it does mean that my academic work has suffered because I don't have the time to pursue things because I'm doing my day job. And I don't think there's any easy thing to that. And much as I like to complain that in 30 years of doing deaf theology I haven't seen any changes, I have very, very slow runs. I mean, this webinar wouldn't have happened 30 years ago for a start. So I just wonder if lots and lots of small things doing will all add up in the end, even though that's frustrating.
Thank you both. And if you'd like to join Hannah and myself and a few others as we plan and dream of our free research commune, please do get in touch. Although, I said that with all the knowledge of sitting here in my privileged position at the university as well. I want to kind of take us a little bit back, and this is a really interesting question that is linked to when we were talking about narratives and so on. And the question was, was, do either of you have experiences where you've challenged the assumptions that healing prayer in our communities are often based on? And this is about both in the parish and other forms of ministry, when people talk about the idea that healing from disability or illness is necessary. So I wonder so the question is whether either of you have any experiences of challenging that and how you did that. Thank you.
Well, anytime I'm asked to talk about healing, I come in to the room and say, I'm deaf, I've been healed. And then I go and explain what I mean by that, because healing for me was not being made hearing again. And the reactions to that have been interesting. Sometimes people get it, sometimes people don't. And a lot of the time, it depends on where they are in their own personal life, their own personal journey, because everybody has all these backgrounds affecting how they react and what they can hear, what they actually understand from what you've said. And I've had people who are disabled feeling that I'm saying that their lives are never going to get any better by the way I talk about healing, and that is something I try to be sensitive to. And I actually have got a couple of examples, I think, good practice in healing ministry and healing prayer. One's from the Iona community and Iona Abbey, and this was my own initial encounter. Well, no, one of my initial encounters with healing. I mean, I've had my share, like all disabled people, of people just coming up to me, laying hands on me and praying for me to hear again. But when I was the first encounter the healing service in Iona, it is incredibly open. They do not define what healing is. They pray for the prayer they use is heal you of all that harms you. And they don't attempt to define the harm. They let you and God and the Spirit work out what that means. Another example, I think, which is very similar, is on Fire Mission, the Catholic Charismatic conference that's actually starting today. And again, they try to be very sensitive, very about consent, very clear if they are praying for healing, that they are not defining who healing is. So the question is, how are you teaching about healing when you have prayers for healing? I think there have to be, I mean, this is the guidelines of the Church of England, that prayers for healing are done in the context of teaching about healing, and in a wide perspective. So that's been some of my experiences.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. It's one of the things that has. So I grew up disabled in churches, and yeah, I am very used to going to a strange church and having hands laid on me when people haven't asked what my name is, and that was an experience that ran through a lot of the stories in At the Gates, and it was really challenging for me to write the chapter on that. Because I was really hoping that in the time since I had been regularly going to church, I stopped going to church for a while during my research for reasons including those kinds of experiences, and I was really hoping that was improving. But I continue to hear about people who are treated, as Hannah says, without consent and in ways that are traumatic, and none of that involves healing. As far as I can see. And I think what we need to do is go back to our theologies of healing, because we've spent a lot of time talking about disabled people as needing healing and people who are sick as needing healing. And there's lots to discuss there, but the problem is the medical model approach, the approach that there is automatically something wrong with me because I come in as a wheelchair user, or I mention that I'm autistic and I need to be prayed for to be changed and to become like everyone else. And in my philosophy, I do not. God made me the way I am. Disabled people, as Hannah says, have really diverse views on that, but we're not hearing the voices of people saying, what do you want to heal here? And I had some great conversations with people for At the Gates who talked about the importance of healing the wounds of ableism. The healing they needed was from the way they had been treated by society, and conversely, society needed healing from its ableism. And that was a framework that gave people a lot of compassion on the very anxious healing ministries that had just wanted to heal them. And there were a lot of people who talked about sort of why people were so obsessed with their healing, and whether it was much more about the person praying and how anxious they were about their body and the fragility of their body and their existence. And we have some great theologies out there of aging, and theologies of changing bodies and decay, and of eco-theologies of the importance of the stages in our lives and of death and resurrection and incarnation, that are all part of this conversation, but often are not. It's often just zooming in on the disabled person. So we need to reinterrogate what we mean by healing and who healing is about, and whether healing should be about oh goodness, Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, I think, the Basileia healing of the whole world. And whether that was what Jesus was demonstrating with the healings, but we read them now through a medical model lens with our modern eye, and we say, but it meant people were broken, but maybe it doesn't.
Thank you both. That's fascinating. And also, as you speak, Naomi, I'm thinking about a lot of eco-theology, feminist eco-theology. In fact, I'm trying to write the paper now very badly. That's looking at what you might say martyrs for the environment, who are willingly breaking their body or allowing their bodies to be broken as a sign and a witness. And how does that change our idea of church? And that's, that I think brings us into this conversation as well. There's a lot of fantastic stuff going on in the chat, and I'm trying to put it together. And I think Anna Bishop's question kind of helps us to look at that. And a lot of what's going on in the chat is looking at, you've both talked about reasonable adjustment, but what does that mean? Because if we center justice, we have to center rights. We're looking at this broader, we have to look at a much more different model of education, a much more different, or shall we say, dismantled model of education. And Anna Bishop, and others have talked about, for example, some TEIs are able to access DSA, others aren't. And I know from speaking to Hannah particularly, we all know the challenges of even accessing DSA and how long it can take to get a laptop or something. I know that there are TEIs here who could definitely relate to that experience as well. So I think Anna's question helps us to unpack all of that a bit. And she says, what can TEIs do to challenge the broader culture of ableism around vocation and discernment? And how can we put pressure on the church to change these processes? Which is a very big question, but I think a very important question about that partnership between the TEIs and the churches as well. Thank you.
I've been part of conversations with TEIs and this and similar areas for quite a long time. It always comes down to the fact that TEIs and the ministry division, and I'm talking very Church of England terms here, are always trying to work out how can you tell somebody is qualified and trained for ministry, because so much of the formation of ministry is a mystery. So TEIs have often gone down this very academic route, because it's an easy, that's an easy way to say, okay, somebody has got to this level of whatever level is of learning in theology, and that means that they are qualified to be a priest, and that actually starts raising all sorts of issues for all the people disabled, but also people with their different educational backgrounds who really struggle to access things. So I think TEI and the ministry division really could work on a lot more of what does it look like. What makes a good minister? How do we know that somebody is ready to be ordained? Because it is a really complicated process. And I have to say, I have been part of this discussion in many different contexts, many different times, and every single time people back off because it's too difficult, it's too complicated, it's going to cost too much money. And also, I suspect that some of the backing off comes from the people who feel threatened by a change of model because they don't feel equipped to work in any other way, because they've always worked the same way, they think the same way. And I know that when I taught on the leadership module, when I was with All Saints, one of the precursors to St Mellitus in the Northwest, today we've got a different name now, Emmanuel College, thank you, in the Northwest. We used to discuss about how, when it comes to leadership in the church, we all unconsciously have a mental model of what a church leader looks like, how they behave, what they say, largely based on what we saw when we were growing up. And while that model is now being challenged and changed because of the increased diversity in clergy, increasing diversity of clergy over the last 20-30 years, there is still a very unconscious, strong perception of what we need to do to be a priest and or a leader or any other leader in the church. And I think that's where the problem is. Until and I mean, if you know the language of paradigm in science, which is when, you know, you need a completely different way of looking at something. You need to challenge some very fundamental concepts. And until that paradigm shift happens, we're tinkering with the edges because people will keep backing off. And I have to say, I think the paradigm shift is something I keep sending out to the Holy Spirit and suggesting that God kicks a few backsides. Doesn't seem to have happened enough yet.
Yeah, I was a big chunk of my research turned out to be with church leaders, which I wasn't expecting. That wasn't among my original research questions, but I ended up doing having some emerging findings on leadership, and talked to a lot of people, especially who'd been through Church of England ordination processes and formation processes, but not just, ministers in some other churches as well. And they were not having an easy time of it. And some of them were quite willing to call out the ableism that is at the heart of our understanding of, as Hannah says, what a priest is, what a church leader is. And it comes back for me to this pastoral power idea that we think disabled people are there to be ministered to, and everyone else will minister to us, but that we're not leaders over others, and our leadership over others can make some people uncomfortable. And I think it's really good to sit with that discomfort and ask what it's about. Does it, for example, come back to some of these ideas around bodies and healing, and who the text from Leviticus that we know have been interpreted many different ways over the centuries, but are still being talked about as though God didn't have disabled priests in the temple. And so, yeah, we have drawn on models that may not have been intended to be what we have used them as. And we've got this idea of what I called in my book an ideal worshipper and an ideal leader in churches, and the ideal leader, the ideal priest, looks non-disabled and thinks in neurotypical ways and uses speech and can hear. It's a really big job challenging that. And this is something that's going on, for example, in the Church of England. There's disability working groups on various topics related to disability who are putting motions forward to synod about TEIs and training and the processes of ordination and the barriers that people hit as they're discerning ordination. And I'll never forget the person who said to me that she started to have conversations about ordination and was told, well, you've got chronic fatigue and we'll never be able to make adjustments to your working time in the church, so maybe you should think about doing something else. And that kind of conversation was something people were having all the time, this underestimation, not just of those people, but of what the church could do and how it could rethink what a priest is, what they look like, what they can do. But we're in the midst of a time when we've got all sorts of difficulties around training and recruiting clergy and financing clergy's roles. And so it's a massive systemic problem. But having the conversations and thinking about what can be done on the small scale. There was a great question in the chat about, we've talked about justice, but less about rights. And I wanted to reiterate that rights and reasonable adjustments are also really important as part of this picture of justice, because we're not in a society that looks like the kingdom of God yet, or a church that does. And so we need to do things like make reasonable adjustments, but we can do that from a place of, as Hannah says, changing our paradigm and thinking like, how can we think more imaginatively about welcoming this person's disruption, as Miriam Spees writes, about welcoming the different way they want to minister and what that could bring to the church. So it's really difficult, but it's good to see Tia talking about it and working together on that.
I'm just going to add a little bit more as someone is a disabled leader in the church. It's a difference that would be fascinating if it was a bit less painful sometimes, but the way people react to me falls into two clear camps. There are those who see me as a priest, you know, highly academically qualified, who happens to be deaf. And there are those who see me as deaf first, working in deaf ministry. And the one group see me as having something to offer to the wider church. So that's how I end up, you know, teaching on All Saints, because the All Saints staff, well, it was different name when I first started. The All Saints staff and my line manager saw me as a highly capable academic with skills in teaching. And I wasn't just there to teach deaf people or talk about deaf people, I was there for the whole church. And on the other side, you've got other people who look at my experience and say, well, you haven't got anything to offer a parish. You know, despite considerable experience of pastoral ministry, because most of my pastoral ministry, not all of it, has been in the deaf community. And so that first group gave me hope that there are people out there who do have power, who exist, who see and encourage the gifts of disabled people as something for the whole church. That second group, I think, are numerically bigger and more powerful. And I think we all need to find ways to challenge that second group. You know, I have to challenge, I exist, which means I'm challenging people all the time. And when other people come in and challenge with me, it just makes my life slightly easier, but also improves the opportunities for other deaf and disabled people. And that's why I think we need to talk about these conversations. We need to find out all the struggles that people are having and challenge them wherever we can, whenever we can. The Church of England, power in the Church of England is incredibly fluid. I mean, I know people love to blame the Archbishop of Canterbury for everything, but really the power in the Church of England is happening at so many different levels from parish upwards, which is why I think each and every person needs to become aware of the power, who is being disadvantaged by it and how you challenge it, because it needs challenging at every levels. Neither top down nor bottom up is ever going to work.
I just wanted to support that with a very tiny story. There's somebody who I wrote about in At the Gates who did get through the ordination process despite being bipolar and being underestimated a lot as a result of that. And the way she got through was by allyship from people who saw her potential, who said, we're going to help you get through these barriers and these structures, even to the extent that she nearly didn't graduate, and people intervened at various levels of the church and the TEI and the diocese. And so it is happening, it is possible, and allyship is part of living out justice. And that's how we start to challenge what's going on at levels that look, I think, insurmountable.
Thank you both. And I feel like we could maybe have a much longer conversation, because I can also see what's happening in the chat. Before I wrap up, I was wondering if I could ask you both very quickly. Now, you've both talked about what TEIs can do together, a few practical examples, a few collaborative examples, and how we may try to think about the engagement with churches, particularly with power. But I'm also wondering, particularly in this time in which we are facing disability cuts and all of these huge structural issues, what can theological education and educators do to be speaking, in a way to be also speaking prophetically, I think, into the public churches? I'm sorry to use an ableist word, speaking, but to be engaging prophetically. How can we have to look at what we need to do in terms of within ourselves, but what do we do, pouring outwards as well? If you have any quick thoughts. Thank you.
I think we can stop seeing it as just a disabled issue. This is a human justice issue, this human rights issue. There's a fascinating thread on Blue Sky today by someone looking at the recent proclamations of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. I'm saying that out loud because if I use the initials, I get muddled with the European Court of Human Rights. And what they've been saying unhelpfully towards a conversation about trans people. And she's going through, this is one of a series of judgments. So the EHRC has become so political that everything they're doing is towards one politics. And so if we start saying, oh, this is only, the cuts they are a huge issue for disabled people, and the church needs to be speaking out. We need to be aware of the impact they're having on people and speaking out, and not in just patronising terms about the most vulnerable in society, like the revered Archbishop and the other bishops following his track, but also saying this is a justice issue. This is the one that affects all of us. I mean, I have been in conversations where in the deaf and disabled world where people are saying, oh, we shouldn't be talking about racial justice, we shouldn't be talking about inclusion of queer people in our churches, we're only talking about deaf and disabled. The more we're divided, the less power we have. And so I think yeah, I'm not sure that answers your question, but that was just a thought I had.
Yeah, I just think speak out at all. In At the Gates, I mentioned Fiona McMillan, and I had a conversation with her about how her ministry with these disabled-led spaces started at St Martin in the Fields Church in London. And she said that back in the early 2000s, when the government was first rolling out cuts to disabled people's benefits and beginning that austerity agenda, and the language of shirkers and scroungers and disabled people as dependent was becoming a real problem, she didn't see any response from the church. And she wanted to know why the Church of England, her church, wasn't speaking out about something that affects so many of its parishioners and affects the land that they contribute to ruling. And so she said, we'll do it from the edge and we'll resource each other. And that was a very powerful moment for her. But I am encouraged that I have seen slightly more speaking out from churches and Christian institutions this time round. There was a great statement from the Joint Public Issues team that is the Baptists, the Methodists and the URC, who focus on social justice. And it is very rare that church social justice programs talk about disability and justice terms, but they were very clear. And they quoted a sermon by, I want to say Martin Luther, John Wesley, where he says that the half the world doesn't know how the other half lives because it doesn't want to know. It closes its eyes, which is exactly what we've been talking about, the perspectives of people that are not heard by those in power. And the church can stand in that prophetic space in the middle and can say, as people as an institution with power, we want to speak for those who are our members and who are in our parishes, and as Hannah says, as a human rights issue, and to move the conversation away from things like economics. Because it is so easy to make people economic targets and to say that people are economically inactive. First of all, that is usually not true. And secondly, why do we value people's lives based on their economic activity? And as a church, we have so many ways to speak against that.
Yeah, I think Naomi's just made a really, really important point that is really theological, is how do we value people's lives? There's this tendency that only people who have value are those who make some sort of economic contribution to society, and we're constantly having to justify ourselves in those terms, which means that when you I mean, why do people have to contribute to be valuable, whether they're contributing economically or practically, so on and so forth? Our value comes from being created as human beings in the image of God. Our value comes, the value of creation comes from being created by God. And I just think we need to do much more theological thinking, but also the thinking is being done, using it more, teaching it more, referencing it more, in concrete practical terms, and not just some kind of nice abstract idea.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to bring us to a close, although I know we can keep talking for a very, very long time. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, please do send me an email, and I'm happy to, if they're happy, I'm happy to connect you to Hannah and Naomi. And I know that the TEIs are already thinking about some of these issues and will continue to do so throughout the year. We've also got more webinars on these issues coming up as well. So the conversation only stops here because of, linear time, but we'll be continuing it in other spaces for sure. I've also put just into the chat links to both Hannah and Naomi's books, and I'll be sending an email with the recording and also all of the resources that we've talked about as well. And in the spirit of collaboration, if you have a resource that we haven't talked about, please do let me know, and I'm happy to add it on as well, so you crowdsource knowledge. And so it only leaves me to say thank you so much to Hannah and Naomi and Jill and Rachel for your knowledge and your wisdom and your collaboration here today. So thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are, and we'll see you next time. So thank you.